I used to think betrayal was something that happened to other people, a word you read in novels or saw in movies, something distant, dramatic, and unreal. But life has a cruel way of teaching you lessons you never asked for. My name's Mark. I'm 45, a construction project manager, father of two, and up until a year ago, I thought I had everything figured out. A stable job, a cozy house in the suburbs, a wife I'd spent 20 years building a life with, Rachel, and a small circle of friends I could count on. Or so I believed. It started with little things. Rachel staying late at work more often, new dresses arriving in the mail, perfumes I didn't recognize. I told myself she deserved to feel good. That maybe I was overthinking it. But that uneasy feeling never left. It sat in the back of my mind like a ticking bomb. Then there was him, Evan, my best friend since college. We'd built our careers together, watched football on weekends, even vacationed as families. He was charming, confident, the kind of guy people naturally gravitated toward. I'd trusted him with everything, including my home, my wife, my children. One night, after another late meeting, Rachel came home smelling like wine and expensive cologne, not hers, not mine. I wanted to believe her excuses. I needed to. But something inside me had already cracked. A few days later, I found Evan's lighter under our couch, silver engraved with his initials. My stomach turned cold. That was the moment the world I'd built for 20 years began to crumble. I didn't confront her right away. No, I wanted proof. Cold, undeniable proof. I started noticing patterns. Her laughter over text messages, the way she guarded her phone, how her tone softened whenever she said Evan's name. Every detail felt like another stab to the gut. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I installed a small camera in our living room, hidden behind the bookshelf. I told myself it was wrong, but I justified it with the thought that they had broken something far more sacred. Tonights later, I sat in my car outside the house, watching the footage on my phone. What I saw shattered me. Evan walked into my home, into my marriage, like he belonged there, and Rachel, she didn't hesitate. She smiled. She welcomed him. The man I'd trusted most in this world had taken everything from me. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I wasn't going to let it end there. That night, something inside me changed. The kind, forgiving man I used to be, he died right there in the glow of that small phone screen, and in his place, something colder, sharper, and infinitely more patient was born. I didn't want justice. I didn't want closure. I wanted revenge. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't slept. My mind kept replaying the images, the sounds, Rachel's laugh, Evan's voice, the way their hands fit together like mine and hers once had. It was like watching my own eulogy play out in slow motion. I went through the motions of normal life, coffee, shower, heading to work, but inside everything was burning. My coworkers joked around as usual, oblivious to the fact that my world had imploded. I smiled when I needed to, nodded at the right moments, and kept my rage buried beneath layers of calm, because that was the key now. Control. Rage makes people reckless. But I wasn't going to let anger drive me, not yet. I would use it, shape it, and make it work for me. My revenge wouldn't come in a flash of fury. It would come slowly, precisely, like frost creeping across glass. First, I needed information. I began to track their movements, subtle things. I sensed Rachel's phone to my cloud account, checked her GPS, and even intercepted some of her emails. What I found confirmed everything. They weren't just sneaking around. They were planning something bigger. A trip to the same cabin in the mountains where Rachel and I had celebrated our 10th anniversary. The irony was almost poetic. I stared at the screen, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. They were planning to go there the following weekend. Perfect. I'd have time to prepare. I didn't tell Rachel I knew. I still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, still played the role of a loving husband. That week, I was the best version of myself, attentive, calm, almost gentle. She didn't suspect a thing. Maybe part of her even felt guilty, but not enough to stop. Meanwhile, I began to craft my plan. I drove to the cabin 2 days before they were set to arrive, telling Rachel I had a surprise business trip. The old place looked exactly as I remembered. The tall pines, the creaking porch, the lake shimmering in the distance. But this time, the air felt different, colder. Inside, I checked every corner, every window. Then I began setting things up, small traps, hidden cameras, and one very specific detail. A note. It simply said, "Every life finds its truth." I left it tucked beneath a wine bottle on the counter. Then I waited. When they arrived, I wasn't there. I watched from a distance, hidden in the trees, the glow of my camera feed flickering on my phone. Seeing them walk into the same cabin where Rachel and I had once danced under fairy lights was a pain I can't put into words. But beneath the heartbreak, there was satisfaction. They were walking into my story now. Hours passed. They laughed, cooked, opened wine, the same bottle brand we'd shared years ago. When Rachel found the note, she froze. Evan laughed it off, said it was probably from an old guest. But I could see it, the flicker of fear in her eyes. That night, as the fire burned low, I sent Rachel a message from an anonymous number. "Do you still sleep well, Rachel?" I watched her face pale as she read it. She looked out the window, scanning the darkness. Evan brushed it off again, trying to play the hero, but I could see the doubt forming. That's when I realized something crucial. Evan wasn't the one in control of their little affair. Rachel was. She always had been. He was just the next man she'd use until he wasn't useful anymore. The thought didn't make me feel better, but it gave me power. Because I knew how to use that weakness. As dawn approached, I quietly slipped closer to the cabin, watching the light from their fireplace fade. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. I wasn't going to confront them, not yet. That would be too easy. No, I was going to let them destroy each other, and when the time was right, I'd be there to finish what they started. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. They never tell you how long it takes to freeze a life. For 3 days after the cabin, I moved like a ghost between our house and the places I needed to be. I kept my calendar full: crew meetings, site visits, supplier calls. Normalcy is a useful costume. It makes people let their guard down. It makes them believe the world can stay the same no matter what private disasters are being staged behind the curtains. On the 4th day, I began to manufacture small accidents that would look like the inevitable creak of a marriage breaking under pressure, not like sabotage, but like the truth finally catching up. First, I focused on paper. My line of work feeds on invoices, timesheets, receipts, stupid little things people forget to lock up. I found a supplier Rachel used for her boutique events, an intermediary who'd always been paid in cash. I called him from a number I didn't care to track, friendly and vague, and asked if he remembered a special package delivered 2 weekends ago to a cabin address. He did. He remembered. Coincidence begins as a sound, then becomes an alarm. I let the alarm ring. Then I touched the things that matter to women like Rachel: reputation and routine. She lived in part on the currency of being polished, a woman who managed clients, charities, school boards. I mailed a carefully worded note to a parent on the PTA, anonymized, clinical, just asking if they had observed anything untoward about the last weekend's chaperone list. People who defend their community react quickly when the idea of impropriety surfaces. I didn't accuse, I asked, the kind of question that makes people check their phones in the middle of dinner. That night Rachel didn't sleep. She paced by the window until 1 in the morning, and I watched the shadow of her figure on the blinds like a confession. She left her phone on the counter, the screen dark. I took it and keyed in a message, anonymous again. "You can run, but fingerprints always remain." I could have been crueler. I chose pinpricks. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to Evan. He was dangerous in his own way, slick, plausible. The sort of man who thinks charm substitutes for conscience. He had a history, one I knew intimately from college nights and shared schemes. While he'd adapted and polished himself, he never fully shed the careless streak that had once gotten him kicked off jobs and forgiven because he could always smile his way out. Evan had to remain the confident liar for as long as possible. He had to live like the man who could fix any sign of trouble. So I began severing his scaffolding. I nudged vendors he'd leaned on into asking for tighter proof of delivery. I made soft calls to one of his recent clients, mentioning in passing a communication mismatch that suggested someone had been giving different versions of the same story. People who rely on illusions hate having to produce receipts. They scramble. They leave trails. Then I pulled a lever neither Rachel nor Evan anticipated. Guilt. There's a brutal art to applying it. You don't shop betrayal at someone. You show them their own contradictions. I printed a few photos, intimate, blurred, private, taken from the cabin footage, and then I left them where they'd be found in ways that wouldn't point back to me. A photo slipped between pages of a charity ledger on Rachel's desk. Another ended up in Evan's company mailbox, folded like a confession. When they discovered those images, they looked as if the floor had fallen out from under them. There's an animal panic that runs through the body when a secret is exposed in public. It's rawer than any private shame. But the strategy had to be surgical. You can't break someone with a single hammer blow and call it art. You disassemble them piece by piece, letting each crack weaken the next. So I seeded small rumors in circles where both of them once felt untouchable. Neighbors who prefer their evening walks quiet. Fundraisers that now needed extra vetting. Clients who suddenly couldn't meet this quarter. The ripple effect is demoralizing. You watch someone you despise enter rooms where the light has subtly turned against them. At home I kept my face. I was the husband who still folded laundry, who still tucked our youngest into bed and read the same ridiculous stories about dragons and brave plumbers. My kids didn't deserve to be casualties. I carried their soft hands into the days like talismans. When my daughter would curl up against my shoulder, smelling like blueberry toothpaste and glue sticks, my heart would punch me sharp, nauseating because I knew there was no way to protect them from the noise once it gathered speed. That knowledge kept me careful in certain small ways. Bills kept paid, school trips attended, soccer practices cheered. You can't be the kind of man who orchestrates ruin and also let your children starve for attention. Every operation has a cost. Mine was my sleep. When the house went quiet, I would go out and drive until the gas gauge nudged warning, watch the road and spool, listen to the whisper of tires and my own breath. At 2 a.m, I would sit somewhere that smelled faintly of pine or coffee and plan the next step like a chess player who enjoys the long rhythm of the game. Sometimes I pictured the conversation I'd have when it was all over, the resignation, the apology, the cold faces at the lawyer's table. Other times the thought of facing my own reflection in a mirror would stop me cold. One evening, as the campaign of soft humiliations compounded, Rachel finally snapped. She cried in the kitchen, not the theatrical kind, just a small, exhausted unraveling. "Why are you doing this?" she asked between ragged breaths. "Are you happy, Mark? Is this what you wanted?" She looked at me like a person pleading with a storm. The accusation in her voice had the power to cut through the fog. It demanded an answer that I hadn't fully formed. I could have told her the truth, then admitted that I'd watched them, had proof, had been setting traps like a man who learned the architecture of deceit. I could have thrown the whole folder on the table and watched the papers flutter, and heard the world rearrange itself in one thunderous sound. Instead, I held her hand and said nothing. Words were currency, and I didn't want to spend them yet. The silence was the weapon I chose. In the following weeks, the fractures multiplied. Meetings were canceled with curt emails. A charity that had once welcomed Rachel's leadership sent a polite note that sensitive matters required her to step back for a season. Evan got a terse call from his boss about client retention, and the call ended with strings of awkward apologies. They bent underweight, I had calibrated to perfection, and the sight of them bending slow and private filled me with relief, and with a sadness I couldn't untie. Late one rainy night, sitting alone with the thumbnails of their lives on my phone screen, I realized something I hadn't known I would have to know. Orchestrating someone's fall makes you a permanent resident in a world you once hoped to leave behind. The courage it takes to do what must be done is a currency that buys you nothing at all. But there was one move left, the one that would force them to look at themselves the way I had for months, with the ledger in my hand, and no illusions. I began preparing it then, with the calm of a man who has finally decided not to flinch. It involved names, bank trails, and a few carefully timed disclosures to people whose authority would make the consequences unavoidable. The rest was patience. I taught myself restraint. I let the slow burn do its work. And all the while, in the hollow between the plan and the outcome, I listened to the sound that I had made, a soft, relentless wind that turned into something like justice or maybe something like doom. The two often feel the same on the tongue. There's a moment in every carefully engineered collapse when the sound of it becomes louder than the hand that started it. Up until that point, I'd been able to make everything feel surgical, small nudges, anonymous emails, a photo slipped in the right place. Those are the things that look like coincidence until they add up into a pattern people can't ignore. But there comes a time when pattern becomes pulse, and pulse becomes a public thing. It began with a letter, an old-school envelope, not an email. Someone had mailed a complaint to the city ethics board about a conflict of interest regarding one of Evan's clients. The writing was neat, deliberately vague, and it landed on a desk that had the power to open an investigation. That letter turned a private headache into a paper trail that public officials had to answer. Once a bureaucracy is awake, it eats time and patience. I watched all of this through windows I'd learned to trust. My hidden cameras had become less about voyeurism and more about bookkeeping. They recorded nothing salacious that couldn't be explained, only moments that, when stitched together with other evidence, formed a narrative impossible to gaslight away. Watching the footage now felt different. The images no longer belonged to me alone. They were exhibits in a case I'd quietly built. Evan didn't disappear quietly. He fought. He hired a lawyer with the kind of smile that makes men think they can talk their way out of consequences. He did the things men do when a life they built on charm starts losing footing. He called contacts, apologized in rooms with curtains, bought dinners that came with expensive bills. There were the expected public defenses, statements about misunderstandings, assurances that internal controls will be improved. People said what they say. It's always possible to extract a little time from the world if you pay for the right scripts. But time too is finite. The first headline hit 2 weeks later. Local executive under review after ethics complaint. The article didn't scream names on its first pass, but everyone in our circle knew who it meant. The tone was not accusatory. It was curious, clinical. But curiosity is dangerous because it invites follow-up. I started getting calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years. An old client asking if everything was true. Former colleagues offering cautious support. A reporter I'd once given an off-the-record tip to asking for confirmation. The echo of my actions ricocheted farther than I'd planned. At home, the echoes changed rooms. My kids started asking questions that left me with hollow answers. My son wanted to know why his friend's mom was talking about grown-up problems at soccer practice. My daughter drew pictures that were more empty than they'd been before. A house with a gap where her mother's figure used to be, a man standing outside the door. Children have a way of seeing things with a cruelty that's not malicious. They just tell truth as a child knows it. Their truth rattled me. Rachel's world unraveled in public and private. A vendor I'd nudged earlier finally called her in a panic. A parent at school forwarded an anonymous complaint to the PTA board. She received letters from neighbors, some kind and confused, some sharp with judgment. I watched her through the kitchen window that evening as she stood under the porch light, phone to her ear, voice small. For a moment I thought about stepping outside, putting an arm around her shoulders and saying, "I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for making this necessary." But I couldn't fabricate that apology. Not then. Not yet. Evan escalated as well. Men who've been carefully dismantled seldom react rationally. He began to point fingers, to try and make the narrative about smear campaigns instead of misconduct. He talked to people who could push back publicly, influencers who once toasted his success, board members who could sway opinion. He tried to construct an alternative truth, that he'd been targeted by an anonymous enemy out to ruin him. There's a rhythm to this behavior: deny, distract, discredit. But when the evidence is a dense fabric and the fabric has weight, it's hard to make the world ignore the smell of smoke. Then the investigator came. Not the dramatic raid people imagine, but someone patient and tired, with a notepad and a calm voice. He asked questions that were precise and unflustered. Can you account for the vendor purchase on May 14th? Who else had access to the client files? Do you have records of meetings off-site? The legalese makes things slow-moving but lethal. He also asked to see certain emails. When Rachel's assistant forwarded a thread, there it was: mismatched dates, a hotel confirmation, a reimbursement sent to an individual that had no corporate justification. Paper is a cold thing. It does not plead. At a certain point, the machinery moved on its own. A subpoena arrived. Evan's name was now tied to a formal inquiry, and the press learned to spell it correctly. People I'd once waved to in the grocery store stopped calling me Mark and started calling me Sir with a brittle politeness that felt like a verdict in itself. Watching them be taken apart was not a simple pleasure. It felt like watching a tree fall in a forest where you started the chain reaction. There was the rush of righteousness, yes, but threaded into it was a persistent, aching loneliness. This is what revenge exacts. It trades a wound for a ledger, and the ledger never heals the place the wound opened. Worse, my actions began to have unintended casualties. An earnest intern was passed over for a promotion because the team was restructuring. A supplier delayed deliveries to families depending on that pipeline. I'd intended to punish the people who betrayed me. I hadn't intended to touch the living, breathing networks around them. Collateral damage rarely announces itself politely. It arrives as a knock at your office door with a mother on the threshold, trying to understand why her life has been disrupted by events that have nothing to do with her child's laughter. Those conversations lodged in me like splinters. There were nights when the sound of my own pulse kept me awake, a loud intruder in a house that otherwise slept. I found myself speaking less and listening more to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant screech of a passing truck, the creak of the floorboard where my daughter always jumped when she ran down the stairs. Small things anchor you back to who you used to be. They reminded me that this was not a game, that people were getting hurt in ways I could not fully control. And yet, there was one more move I had to make. Justice, I told myself, requires a finality that rumor and suspicions don't provide. You need a document with a stamp, a signature, an authority that cannot be ignored. So I gathered the last pieces: payment trails that led through intermediary accounts, photos with timestamps, correspondence that connected Evan to vendors who had been paid for things that never existed. I handed the folder to an investigator I trusted, the kind who treats facts like sacred things. He listened, nodded, and then did the thing I'd been waiting for. He took action that could not easily be undone. Within days, a formal complaint moved from rumor to law. The board convened. Contracts were frozen. The city began to ask questions in a tone that meant more than curiosity. Compliance would be enforced. When the first official notice arrived at Evan's office, his face went the color of someone who suddenly realized That charm is not currency in a court of records. The fallout made the neighborhood smaller. People began to match names to faces with the speed of gossip that had outlived integrity. Some offered sympathy, others took practical distance. I received a message from an old friend that read, "I understand you wanted justice, but at what cost?" That question, asked not in accusation but in wounded curiosity, stayed with me. The echoes were loud now. They bounced into rooms I'd wanted to keep sacred. They touched children and vendors. The kindly old neighbor who'd once lent me a ladder, the barista who used to call my name when my usual coffee was ready. I hadn't planned those reverberations. I'd planned a reckoning, and a reckoning had become an earthquake. And in the quiet between the tremors, I realized this. The hand that pulls the string is not immune to the movement it makes. If you push long enough, the force curves back. You cannot be both the engineer of ruin and the untouched survivor. That, more than anything else, unsettled me. At the edge of everything, on a night when the rain felt like small percussion on the roof, I sat with the folder open and the kids asleep in the other room. I thought about the man I'd been, the father who read silly books in goofy voices, the husband who once thought marriage was a contract more solemn than a ledger. I thought about the man I'd become, precise, patient, a strategist of pain. The line between the two seemed to blur. I had one final decision to make: finish the work I'd started and watch the world rearrange itself around the new absence, or walk away and accept that some wounds cannot be mended by paperwork, no matter how decisive the signature. The investigator was ready. The case was solid. Tomorrow all evidence would change status from suspicious to formal, and lives would shift again. I closed the folder and, for the first time in months, I let myself feel the cold honestly. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was the dull ache of someone who had traded a life for balance and discovered the scales were heavier than he'd imagined. The echo I'd made had become a chorus, and it was asking a price that I hadn't fully calculated. The day the subpoenas arrived, the house breathed like a living thing, uneasy aware. I remember standing in the kitchen, the envelope trembling slightly in my hand, the paper as ordinary as everything that had once been ordinary between us. Legal language is quiet violence. It arrives in polite fonts and neutral margins and calls itself due process. It called my life into a different room. Eben called me the night the investigator took his statements. He sounded smaller than I expected. Not the smug guy who could sell you a piece of glass as if it were a diamond, but a tired man who'd run out of answers. "Mark," he said, voice raspy from too much talking, "this is bad." There was no plea, no attempt at charm. Only the rawness of someone watching a construction he helped direct be dismantled while he still occupied scaffolding that suddenly felt unsafe. "You made your bed," I said. It came out harsher than I intended. He didn't argue. He hung up. When the formal inquiry became public, things accelerated. Boards convened, statements were requested, and people who had once accepted Evan's voice as a warm thing now spoke in clauses. Rachel stopped going into the office. The PTA mails, once full of cheerful plans and bake sale logistics, turned into a flurry of concerned, awkward replies. The neighborhood that used to look like a postcard now resembled a courtroom in miniature, with neighbors deciding whose side to take during the slow, humid summer. The press called. A writer wanted to know if I felt vindicated. "Vindication isn't a thing you feel," I told him. "It's a sentence you read." He put that line in the piece the next morning, and a few people sent it to me as if that had been the point all along. It wasn't. There's a moment in these stories, the part that people lean forward for, where the villain is unmasked, and the audience cries. Finally, they don't see the hours afterward. The way quiet lives have to be stitched back together. They don't see our kids trying to understand why their parents' faces carry new lives. They don't hear the small, constant refrain, "How did we get here?" Parents' hands used to be safe. Now my children sometimes touch me and quickly pull away as if they felt a spark they didn't want. Evan pleaded guilty in a judge's chamber where people wear patience the way others wear suits. Fraud charges, restitution, community service, that reads like symbolism more than penance. He got time on paper and less time in a cell because his lawyer was deft and the prosecution pragmatic. The sentence read like a ledger entry, measurable, calculable, tidy. It left me with the taste of a deal, not the warmth of closure. Rachel's professional life unraveled in a different register. Her employer placed her on leave, then cut ties. The town's social circles cooled into polite distance. Friends I'd thought steadfast closed ranks slowly, like curtains. I ran into her once at a grocery store, both of us pretending the cereal aisle was a neutral place. She looked older than her years. No apologies passed between us. We had already spoken in other languages, in files, in testimony, in the way the kids now split time between houses. That was our conversation now. In the quiet that followed the noise, I had time to watch the consequences I'd engineered ripple outward in ways I hadn't fully intended. A vendor I'd nudged into questioning invoices lost a contract and had to lay off a worker. The intern who forwarded a thread to compliance sent me a message later that said, simply, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Her sorrow landed like a stone. My campaign had been aimed at two people who'd betrayed me. The fallout touched 100 small lives. The ledger had more columns than I'd expected. Sometime in the late autumn, 2 months after the last headline, I found myself at the lake where our families had once celebrated in easier summers. The water reflected the lowering sky. Geese drifted like slow punctuation marks. I took my wedding ring out of my pocket. It had been in a drawer for weeks, heavy with habit. I turned it in my fingers and felt less of a symbol and more of a measurement, an object that counted years, not love. I didn't think about throwing it away as an act of defiance. I thought about what letting it go would mean. Maybe the truest gesture was not to fling it into the dark water, but to accept that holding it would not bring anything back. I slid it over my index finger once, twice, then pressed it into the mud at the shoreline until the cold seeped over my knuckles. I left it there like a quiet confession. My children asked questions over cereal the next week. Why can't we all live in the same house? Why does Daddy look sad? I answered as truthfully as a man who'd been both a detective of lies and a dealer of consequences could. We're fixing things, I told them. We're making sure you're safe and loved. It was a cowardly phrase and a necessary one. Love had changed its shape. My job now was to keep the new shape stable. The months taught me that revenge is both teacher and jailer. I had learned to be patient, strategic, and unrelenting. I had learned how to make truth move like an avalanche. But in learning that, I had also learned the cost. The things you cannot buy back are eyes that no longer meet yours without calculation. Dinners where laughter is measured, and the tiny forfeitures of trust that become difficult to reclaim. Forgiveness didn't come in megaphones or declarations. It arrived in small, awkward mornings, making school lunches, going to soccer games, sitting in the dark when my daughter's nightmare had her calling for me. Those moments were not exciting. They were not cinematic. They were painstaking, humble acts that slowly reconfigured what family meant. And somewhere in doing those ordinary things, I found the smallest form of repair. Presence. Some nights I still dream of the cabin, the soft spill of firelight, the clutter of plates, the snap of a twig underfoot. Dreams complicate lessons because they keep scent and sound intact. I wake with the echo of voices that once promised fidelity and find instead the present, the coffee cooling in my kitchen, the quiet hum of laundry, the knighted drawings stuck to the fridge with magnets shaped like dinosaurs. People ask me now if it was worth it. Sometimes I think the right answer is yes, because I couldn't have lived under the lie. Sometimes I think the honest answer is I don't know. I regained a name, an honesty in the public ledger, an answer to the question of what I would tolerate. I lost an image of myself that was softer and perhaps more naive. I gained patience and a capacity to be present in unglamorous ways. I lost the illusion that justice is clean. If there is a last line to this story that sits true to me, it is this: the hardest part of taking back what was stolen is learning what you can live with afterward. I wanted them to feel the fracture they had created. They did, but the fracture didn't stop there. It ran through a neighborhood, a workplace, a family. It left a corridor of altered faces. So I make school lunches now. I answer night calls. I hold my son while he cries for no reason I can name. I let my daughter tell me the same joke 3 times and laugh with her each time. In small repetitions, I find a steadiness. One evening, months after the last hearing, I walked past the old office where Ethan used to park. A new car was in the spot, a different nameplate on the door. The town keeps turning. So do we. I am not the same man I was. I wear that like a weathered coat, practical, warm, imperfect. Sometimes in the late dark I think about whether I would do parts of it again. The honest answer is messy. I would change what I could. I would keep what helped my children sleep better at night. I would never pretend that revenge made things whole. But I would not be silent either. At the edge of everything, what remains is small and stubborn. An ordinary life rebuilt around care and a stubborn, private vow to teach my children how to love without the quiet consent of betrayal. That vow is my recompense. It is not loud. It is not glorious. It is the heavy, ongoing work of being human after having been broken,